Hi, I'm Greg Scott, and welcome to my mini seminar about trust on the Internet. Trust on the Internet is every bit as much about psychology as technology, and it's not as straightforward as you might think. Everyone who uses the Internet, which is pretty much everyone these days, needs to know how trust works. All the opinions reflected in this presentation are my own and not necessarily those of my employer. During his 2016 New Year's Eve vacation in Florida, President-elect Donald Trump held court in front of the TV cameras and talked about the election and whether or not the Russians interfered. His quotes also showed up in the New York Times on New Year's Day 2017, page A10. Here's what he said. "And I know a lot about hacking, and hacking is a very hard thing to prove, so it could be somebody else. And I also know things that other people don't know, and so they cannot be sure of the situation." My jaw dropped. Yeah, right, Donald. And I'm as much an expert on New York real estate as you are with computer hacking. Here's some more of what he said. "I don't care what they say. No computer is safe. I have a boy who's 10 years old. He can do anything with a computer. You want something to really go without detection, write it out and have it sent by courier." Donald. I need to thank you for giving me great material to work with. You do realize, Donald, that the good guys nailed Osama bin Laden because we followed his courier, right? You might want to attend some of those intelligence briefings and learn about this stuff. And that leads to the first thing to remember about trust on the Internet. Learn the basics. This might save you from making a fool out of yourself. It's Literacy 101, and right now our U.S. national leaders look like the Three Stooges. We have to do better. Here's the issue we need to deal with. Alice wants to talk to Bob. Now maybe Bob is Alice's bank, or maybe an online retailer, or maybe he's just some guy named Bob. But Bob is on the other side of the Internet, so how does Alice know that this entity claiming to be Bob really is Bob? And how do they communicate privately across a public medium like the Internet? We need some theory for this to make sense, and there's no getting around it. You don't need to be a computer scientist, but you do need to know what encryption is, and you need to know what the public key infrastructure is all about, and you need to know why digital certificates are important. It's kind of like when you had to learn about street signs during driver's training. I promise it won't hurt. First up is encryption. The principles haven't changed one bit since Roman times. Here's an example message using a Caesar cipher. A Caesar cipher just means you go up and down some number of letters in the alphabet for every letter of the message and substitute. In this case, the key is 1. So if you wanted to send the message, "Crypto is cool," using a Caesar cipher with a key of 1, here's what it would look like. From left to right, see how we substitute D for C and S for R and so on? Today's algorithms are a lot more complicated and they use much bigger keys, but the concepts are identical, which proves that sometimes the more things change, the more they really do stay the same. The thing to remember here is all encryption starts with plain text. Apply an algorithm and an encryption key to produce ciphertext and send your message. Decryption is just the opposite. See, that's not so bad. Today's keys use 512 or even 1024 bits, and those will get bigger as computers keep getting more powerful. Here's what a 512-bit number looks like in decimal without the commas. That's 155 digits. That's a lot of digits. So let's say Alice has a plain text message, she has an algorithm, and she has a key. Alice needs to send an encrypted message to Bob. How does Bob get the key so he can decrypt Alice's messages? That's another challenge that's been around for a long time. So in 1977, Ralph Merkle, Whitfield Diffie, and Martin Hellman came up with a slick solution. Today it's called a Diffie-Hellman exchange, and with a little practice, you and a partner can use the same concept to freak out people at a party. Here's what you do. In a room full of people, trade random numbers with your partner in front of the whole room with everyone else listening and watching. Or even better, have somebody at random give you and your partner those first seed numbers. You each do a calculation against the numbers you received, and then you and your partner trade the intermediate numbers you came up with. Again, do this in front of everyone. No funny stuff. Do another calculation, and this time you'll both come up with the same result. That number is your shared key. The two of you know it, but nobody else in the room knows it, even though they all listen to you trade numbers. How's that for slick? This is where you freak everybody out. When you're all done, each of you write your final result down on a piece of paper and show it to the crowd. The crowd will go wild when they all see that both of you came up with the same number. Don't worry about Diffie-Hellman details for now. You can look those up on the internet. I might do another mini seminar on how it works if there's interest. Also, remember that Diffie-Hellman is great for coming up with a common key value, but it does nothing to verify that Bob really is Bob. It's one thing when you're in that room and looking at your partner. It's a whole different ballgame for Alice and Bob with the internet in between. We need PKI, or public key infrastructure, for that. PKI uses a principle called asymmetric encryption. It means you encrypt with one key and decrypt with a different key. Sounds innocent enough, right? Would you believe an entire industry sprang up around this concept? Here's the idea. Now that you have two keys, you make one key public and keep the other one private. This is a big deal. Let's say somebody wants to send you a private message. Anyone can encrypt that message with your public key and send it over. You'll decrypt it with your private key, and that's how anyone can start a private conversation with you. PKI algorithms are computationally intensive, so we don't use them for ongoing conversations, just to set them up. Now this is also huge. With PKI, you can digitally sign documents by encrypting your signature with your private key. Send it out to the world, and anyone can decrypt with your public key. That's how they know the document came from you. It's kind of like handwriting analysis on the internet, or maybe the wax seal imprinted by the king if you're still into couriers. Which leads to digital certificates. Meet Kathy. Everyone trusts Kathy to sign special documents called digital certificates by encrypting them with her private key. Kathy is a certificate authority, or CA, and she makes money signing certificates. Think of a CA as kind of like a Department of Trust, but CAs are private businesses, not government agencies. So let's say Bob buys a certificate from Kathy and shows it to Alice. When Alice decrypts Bob's certificate and compares it to an original plaintext copy, Alice will trust what it says because she can verify that Kathy signed it. Pretty cool, huh? We need one more player in this drama. Meet Melvin, the man in the middle. This is where we cue the evil guy music. He has shifty eyes and he looks like an old cartoon character. Melvin wants to disrupt the dialogue between Alice and Bob. Now maybe he wants to steal money, maybe he just wants to spy on either party. But he is a very real threat despite the humorous picture, and security professionals lose lots of sleep over him. By the way, Melvin is not always a bad guy. There are popular applications that take advantage of a man in the middle. We can't call it an attack because that's how these apps are written. File sharing apps are one example, so is Skype. But for this discussion, Melvin is always a bad guy. Now we're ready to put it all together. Consider this dialogue between Alice and Bob. Alice starts out. Alice says, "Hi, Bob." And Bob says, "Hi, Alice." And Alice asks Bob, "Please transfer $100 from my checking account to my savings account, and here's my password." So Bob takes care of it, and he comes back and says, "No problem, it's done." And Alice says, "Thanks, Bob." Bob says, "You're welcome, Alice, and thanks for banking with Bob." Simple, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, look what happens when Melvin gets in the middle. I color-coded the players so you can see who says what in my thrilling, suspenseful dialogue. Alice only wants to move $100 from her checking account to her savings account, but Melvin inserts himself in the middle of the conversation and fools Bob into sending Melvin everything in Alice's checking account. Alice won't be happy when she finds out later that she's broke, and Bob sure won't like the harm to his reputation either. So, how does Bob keep Melvin out of the middle of his dialogue? Here's what happens. Every year, Bob pays Kathy to send him a new certificate attesting that Bob really is Bob. Anyone can verify it by checking Kathy's digital signature. Alice could do the same thing. Alice could verify herself, but today we mostly use digital certificates to verify banks and online retailers, not consumers. Alice knows Bob should be able to show her a certificate. So before Alice shares anything sensitive with Bob, like her bank account number, Alice first makes sure that Bob's certificate has a proper signature from Kathy. Melvin can't get in on this action. Curses. Foiled again. The whole system depends on trust. Both Alice and Bob trust that Kathy will never send a copy of Bob's certificate to Melvin. They also both trust that Kathy will never share her private key, which would allow others to impersonate Kathy. And that leads to two questions. How does Kathy set herself up in a position of trust, and what happens if she messes it up? By the way, CAs are prime cyber attack targets. You'd think they would be leaders in cyber defense. Well, on the first question, earning a position of trust, Kathy does it by convincing the web browser manufacturers to trust her. So when Alice visits Bob's website and Bob sends back a certificate signed by Kathy, Alice's browser looks for Kathy in its list of trusted CAs. If Kathy is in that list, and if all the other fields in that certificate check out, then Alice's browser trusts it. Otherwise, Alice's browser sends an invalid certificate warning to Alice, and Alice needs to make a decision. Now check this out. This is why people get confused, because there's a few players. Alice is a consumer, Bob is a service provider, Kathy is a certificate authority, and Melvin is trying to break into things. Keep your players straight, and this will all make sense. Here's an example of what an invalid certificate error looks like. I took this screenshot from a typical home internet router, and I used the Firefox web browser because Firefox gives me usable information about the warning, so I can make a good judgment call on what to do about it. If you see one of these from your banking website or an online retailer, it means your browser found a problem with the certificate. Your browser doesn't trust it. You probably shouldn't either. But if you see a warning like this from, say, a cheap home internet router, it might not be as big a deal. I just noticed this as I put this together. Look closely at that warning. It says that router last renewed its certificate in 2006. Maybe I should do another mini seminar about securing home internet connections. Also, notice the HTTPS that I highlighted in the beginning of the URL string. HTTPS is just a protocol that says my browser wants to see your certificate and wants to encrypt our messages. HTTPS is not a guarantee of safety by any means, but it's a fundamental component. So what happens if Kathy does violate her trust? The summary is nothing good. Everyone who trusts Kathy is now at risk. Imagine what might happen if Kathy secretly sells Bob's certificate to Melvin. Well, then Melvin could impersonate Bob, and nobody would know the difference until it was too late. Even worse, imagine Melvin stealing Kathy's private key. Now Melvin could impersonate Kathy and issue his own certificates all over the place. And there's even more risk. With hundreds of CAs in the real world, and with many of those CAs delegating trust to still other CAs, attackers have lots of targets to go after. At best, it's a mess when a CA falls down on the job. At worst, it could be a global disaster. This isn't just hypothetical. Lots of CAs have been penetrated over the years, and this slide shows a few examples. Just do a Google search for certificate authority cyber attacks, and you'll find more references. So, does this mean the whole system is broken? Some people say yes. Others take a more nuanced stance. All experts agree, though, that the system is not perfect. But there's no widespread agreement on how to fix it or how to replace it with something better, which is really no different than couriers if you think about it. So what do consumers and Alice do about all this? Well, number one, proceed with your eyes open. Remember that HTTPS is just a protocol. It's not any guarantees. Don't believe the advice that tells you it's always safe. The system is not as foolproof as online vendors want you to believe, but it's not as bad as many sensationalists scream. For what it's worth, I've been shopping online since 1999, and I'm a credit card fraud victim myself, but I run into more trouble from poorly built websites than anything else. You need to know about one other popular attack vector. It's called DNS poisoning, and it has a few components. First, an attacker builds a website that looks like the login screen of your banking website, or maybe your favorite retailer. Next, the attacker figures out a way to change your translation for the IP address, say www.bobsbank.com. The attacker changes the IP address where it's supposed to point to the attacker's IP address. To pull this off properly, he also needs to infiltrate a CA to get a certificate for his website that looks legitimate. Once he sets all that up, when Alice goes to what she believes is Bob's bank website, she actually ends up on Melvin's fake website. She enters her login credentials and Melvin's website says they're no good. And now Melvin owns Alice. By the time Alice finds out she's been hoodwinked, it's too late. Melvin's or one of his buddies has already drained all of her bank accounts and charged up all her credit cards to the max, and maybe even taken out a mortgage on an expensive property in the Caribbean. Does that sound too elaborate or maybe too cloak and dagger for the normal world? Well, it's not. This kind of stuff happens all the time. Heed the advice about keeping your devices clean. See my mini seminar about phishing schemes for details. That's phishing with a PH. What if you're in Bob's shoes? What if you're a service provider? Then what do you do about it? Well, some banks ask consumers to select an image when they set up their profiles. When the consumer starts to log on, the bank displays the image as an assurance that the bank website really came from the bank. If Alice is at Melvin's fake website, Melvin won't know what image to display. It's a great theory, but it depends on consumers being sharp enough to spot it. And most aren't. But maybe now you will be. Other sites are implementing two-factor authentication. When you log in from a new computer, the bank sends a text message to your cell phone with a code. Enter the code into the website to log in. This verifies that you're you to the bank. Some software companies don't trust public CAs anymore, and they sign their own certificates instead. But browsers don't list these software companies as trusted CAs, so accessing those websites trigger errors, which forces Alice to apply a judgment call instead of just closing down websites that present certificate errors. One thing's for sure, there are no universal answers, so beware of one-size-fits-all checklists. Keep your wits about you. Thanks for watching my mini seminar about trust on the internet. And again, all the opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and not necessarily those of my employer. If you want to get in touch with me, here's my email address. You can see it on the slide, gregscott@infrasupport.com, and my Twitter name is dgregscott. And if you're interested in other mini seminars, check out my website at www.bullseyebreach.com. And thanks for putting up with my amateur narration.